Good morning, all. Thanks for joining for another episode of Leonid's Live Lounge. And today I'm joined by Sean Miner. Good morning, Sean. Thanks for joining us.
Morning, Jimmy.
Sean
Thanks for having
is
me.
the thank you. Sean is the US Trade Compliance Director for DOJÖ, a boutique trade and customs consulting firm. Sean has, before this, 6 years at KPMG within their trade and customs practice, and then before that, 5 years within the DC think tank world, studying trade policy. So you've had experience, Sean, at the high level, and then kind of diving into the detail and helping companies out on the ground too. But yeah, thank you again for joining us. And today we're going to have a little bit of a discussion on the potential implications on the results of the US election and what that can mean for international trade. And I appreciate news is moving extremely fast at the moment, and even only this week, news have been coming out. So, Sean, why don't you give us an overview initially of kind of how you see things at the moment, where we are at, and then we can go from there. Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
Okay,
So,
good.
what we saw this week from President-elect Trump was a tweet on his social network, Truth Social, that said he is threatening to impose 25% tariffs on products from Mexico and Canada into the US, as well as 10% on products from China. And that was in relation to another kind of diplomatic issue with the U.S. and its neighbors about immigration, but also the flowing of drugs, illegal drugs like fentanyl, into the U.S. So on the China side, he's accusing them of making and shipping it. And on the Canadian and Mexican side, they're accused of allowing those goods and the people to flow across the borders into the U.S. And so he's clearly using this as a negotiating tactic. But I wouldn't say that means those tariffs aren't going to be in effect, right? But I think it'd be best to also step back a little bit and review just more of what Trump has said over the past 6 to 12 months during the campaign about trade and tariffs. So first, I always start with China because that's the word, the second most used word out of Trump's mouth, which is the other one is the most used word is tariff. And he targets China frequently for a number of grievances, basically. And his answer to most of those grievances is tariff, products from China. And he already did that in his first term. He implemented what's called the Section 301 tariffs on products from China. And there was an investigation. The Chinese economic policies were found to be harmful to U.S. industry and national security. And therefore, they put between 7.5 and 25% tariffs on many of the products from China. Not all, maybe about 2/3 of the products in terms of value. But he implemented that. And then he also put tariffs on products from steel and aluminum from most importers, from most countries in the world importing into the U.S. So 10% for aluminum, 25% for steel. Now, right, he's saying that he wants to increase the tariffs on products from China to 60% or more or less. We don't know because he says different things at different times. But that's a number we've heard more frequently, is 60%. I think it's a number that people should be expecting and be ready for. If you're working in a company and you're importing products from China into the U.S., you should, and we'll talk about it in a second, be doing an analysis on that. Second is on Mexico, right? We just spoke about Mexico in another context, but he's also just mentioned tariffs on products from Mexico in general. It's a really interesting dynamic between the U.S. and Mexico because we have this free trade agreement with Mexico, U.S., Mexico, and Canada called the USMCA. And Trump renegotiated that. Basically, he's the one who signed it, right? It was formerly called NAFTA, and now he got this deal, but now he still wants to put tariffs. He really has this desire to stop goods and really I think the genesis is that he doesn't want companies uprooting from the U.S. and then going to Mexico and then shipping those goods back to the U.S. So I think there's a really interesting dynamic there. Third is tariffs on products from the EU. So not only Trump, but his former United States Trade Representative, the chief trade negotiator of the U.S., Robert Lighthizer, has also said that he believes that trade between the U.S. and the EU is imbalanced and unfair. And the way they measure that is the trade balance, meaning that the U.S. buys a lot more from Europe than Europe buys from the U.S. So those are three big tariffs that might be coming down the pipeline. The last one I need to mention, though, is about a general import tariff. He has said this numerous times, that he wants to impose a broad import tariff on all or most goods coming into the U.S. This is a major, major change in terms of trade policy. It would have far-reaching implications for the U.S. economy, but it depends on how the implementation is, and we can get to that in a little bit. But he's mentioned 10 or 20% on all or most imports, which is a very significant development.
Yeah, that's a good summary. And before we go on to sort of how Trump can do this, the news this week on the 25% with Canada, Mexico, and 10% for China, was that a surprise to you? Was that more? Was that less? What was your initial reaction when you saw the news?
Yeah, it's a good question, because for me, one of the most interesting aspects there was 10% on China, right? It's not a lot. He already has 25% on a lot of the products from China, so that's not really going to move the needle that much. So, but maybe it's also just saying that China's role in this trade of illegal drugs, especially fentanyl, is, maybe they're less important than the role of Mexico and Canada and allowing those goods to come in, right? And there's debate about really how those goods come in. Some of them may be shipped in small packages, etc. I think that's it. But the tweet itself was a surprise, right? We're in a moment right in between the election and the inauguration where Trump is already having an effect on U.S. foreign policy, but he's not president yet. We saw that last time as well when he won the election. So wielding his sword quickly and early is not a surprise, but it can surprise people for sure. So
okay, great. And then looking ahead, once he becomes president in January, what are the legal means that Trump could impose these tariffs?
Yeah, so normally U.S. trade policy or commercial activity in the United States is governed by U.S. Congress, not the president. But over the decades, Congress has slowly granted more and more power to the president in terms of trade. And so now there are laws that allow the president to have significant influence on trade policy without having to involve Congress, for good or for bad. That's how it is. And so I mentioned one earlier, which is the Section 301 Act, tariffs on products from China. So this was a special law from 1974 that allowed the president to enact an investigation, which resulted in tariffs. Same thing with the Section 232 tariffs. But then there's another law that I think, that there's a lot of expectations Trump will use a lot more, which is called IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA. And it allows the immediate imposition of tariffs upon the declaration of a national emergency. Okay, well, who can declare a national emergency? The president himself. So all he has to do is first declare a national emergency, and then he has very sweeping powers. It's not like Congress has to approve this emergency. Right. And Trump already declared a national emergency in his first term related to immigration. So there's no reason to think he wouldn't use that again now in terms of trade policy. And the recent announcement about day one tariffs on products from Mexico, Canada, and China we just talked about, if it really is day one of the only ways you can do that is through IEEPA, right? So he would declare a national emergency his first day and then write what's called an executive order executive order, these presidential powers. However, they have to be based on law, right, to have some effect. But we already just talked about the laws that they can be affected on, Section 301, Section 232. The final one I want to mention here is something that's more long lasting. And that is U.S. congressional action, right? We're talking about a bill that's passed through the House and the Senate and then signed by the president. These are laws that have longer reaching implications and therefore signal more of a sea change, right? Biden could have removed those China tariffs at any point with just the stroke of a pen during his term over the past 4 years. He didn't. But it just tells you the weakness, I guess, of those executive orders, because they can be just taken away. U.S. congressional action, a law is passed, and you have to pass another law to get that out, and that's much more difficult. And so when we see things happening through Congress, then we have understanding that it's going to be here to stay for a while.
So maybe the first 2 years before the midterms, while he has the House and the Senate, we may see some activity in this space. Interesting. Sure. Okay. Yeah. And just taking a step back, and I know some of it will be obvious to us and to our network, but I think it's important to state it. What impact could this have on international trade around the world? I mean, what could the repercussions be from these moves?
Yeah, there's big geopolitical and geoeconomic issues at play here. First, right, let's just talk about the elephant in the room, which is China, right? There's been so much economic activity moved to China over the past 25 years since China has joined the WTO. It was 23 years ago in 2001. And that has created a new dynamic in the world where China has become the powerhouse manufacturer of, so many things. But it's also created a lot of imbalances, right? And those imbalances have political implications, which we're seeing in the U.S., right? U.S. lost a lot of manufacturing jobs over the 10 years after China joined the WTO. There's there's some economic studies that directly point that China as WTO accession is part of that. And so, right. And then you see the political implications with people being upset that U.S. manufacturing is so weak, et cetera. And then they elect, different presidents, right? So those are important implications. Thinking about that, okay, well, a couple things matter here. What I think is if the U.S. is just going alone in this, right, then a lot of what the U.S. would like to happen with his reduced economic activity in China will be diminished, right? China can just kind of shift their exports from the U.S. to the rest of the world. Of course, it will impact China, and China will take a hit, no doubt about it. And for sure, they're nervous about their economic growth at this moment. But it would be best if the U.S. could work with other big players in the world, EU, Japan, et cetera, to say, hey, let's have some coordinated activity. And if that's the impact they really want to have, which is to shift manufacturing away from China, to rebalance the global economic order. So I think those are important. But let's talk about U.S. allies for a minute, right? Mexico, Canada, EU, Japan, Korea, et cetera. These are countries that, right, the U.S. is happy to have what's called friendshoring, right? Instead of manufacturing in China, U.S. prefers, the most preferred obviously is to manufacture in the U.S., but the second preferred is to manufacture in a friendly country. But now that throws this up in arms because, right, you want to put a factory in Mexico, but you're not sure if tariffs are going to happen. Or you have a factory in Europe. How stable are your exports to the U.S. going to be at this point? So there's so much uncertainty, which, uncertainty in many aspects is not great for investment, right? Investment is kind of a long-term decision. If you have a lot of money, you want to build a plant or a factory somewhere, you need to be relatively sure of how things are going to be in 5 years. And right now we have no idea. So I think there's just a lot of uncertainty. I think a lot of things will be cleared up in the first 6 to 12 months in terms of term. And so, then we'll see kind of the dynamic that happens. But
It's interesting. If I'm looking at it from the UK perspective as well, it's going to be a real balance for the UK because at one time we want to renew our ties with the EU and get closer trade with the EU, while at the same time trying to look across the pond and look for a free trade agreement there with the US. And I'm not sure how we're going to balance that. So it's going to be quite interesting, I think, for the UK government to make that work. But yeah, and I guess we're discussing here about what the US could do and what tariffs may come in with the new administration. But we also need to look at what the response will be as well. It's not a one-way street. This. So how do you think countries will react to US tariffs this time and compare it to last time?
Yeah, it depends on the tariff. So let's talk about a general import tariff. If it's a import tariff on most products coming into the U.S., the reaction from the world on the last time that happened was mixed. And that I'm referring
Okay.
to the tariffs on steel and aluminum on most countries. Some countries retaliated. Europe, Mexico, others didn't. Japan and Korea and others decided this doesn't really make sense.
Right.
It's not going to have an impact because it wasn't directly targeted at us. It was more targeted as a U.S. protectionism policy for their domestic manufacturers. Right?
Yeah.
It's a global problem, also caused by China because China produces so much steel and aluminum and then floods the world with it, which lowers prices and companies go out of business. But if it's targeted tariffs like against Mexico, against China, against the EU, I'm pretty certain all those countries or economic blocs will retaliate in some form or another. Some may take a diminished approach, but
Okay.
we've heard that the EU is already creating lists of products they want to target. It's also a very good reason if you have some industries you want to protect and say, okay, hey, why don't we pick and choose how we're going to retaliate that favors our own companies? Why not? Because you don't want to hurt yourselves as well when you're retaliating, and I think some retaliation will happen. Chinese, they're going to retaliate in a number of ways, not just on import tariffs, but maybe on export restrictions on certain products. They've already seen that happening in certain aspects, or maybe sanctions. They have a number of tools they've been using. So that's just to say, yeah, I think it's going to be a mixed bag in terms of retaliation.
Interesting. Okay, great. And then looking at, both Leonid and DOJÖ are working with multinational corporations, either from a recruitment perspective or consultative perspective. What actions do you think that these multinational companies can take to mitigate potential changes in trade policy, and how do you think they could build resiliency to this?
Yeah, it's a lot of what we're talking to clients about now, which is word resiliency and agility. We don't know what's coming, but we have an idea. So let's do all the upfront preparation we can. And the first step is assess. Okay, you want to understand your imports, especially into the US, at a very fine level. So obtaining your import data, you can do that from the US Customs, and doing an analysis on that, knowing exactly how much you import from China, exactly how much you import from Mexico, what you're importing, what are the HTS codes of that, what duties you paid last year, maybe do some forecasts. Okay, what if the Chinese tariffs rise from 25% to 60%? What would be the difference in duties that we're going to pay? So at least you have that knowledge and a baseline. Hey, what are we facing? And then you can start to have some strategies or use government programs in order to help your company save money where you can, right? So it's about having a duty mitigation program, and I'll talk about the U.S., but it's something you're going to need to think about globally, right?
Yeah.
A big program in the U.S. is duty drawback, which is when you import a product and you pay a tariff, and then you export the same or similar product, you can get that import duty back from U.S. Customs. And it applies for manufacturing as well. If you import components and pay tariffs and you manufacture a finished good, a car, and then you export that car, you can get the import tariff back on those imported components. So very lucrative program if you're an exporter. But it takes time to set up. So you need to start thinking about those things right now. Okay, do we need to get into duty drawback, right, et cetera? There's another program called first sale for export. It's really an import program where there's at least a three-tiered transaction, right? You have manufacturer selling to a middleman, and the middleman is selling to your entity in the US. Well, if you're paying the middleman $100 for this product, the middleman is paying $80 for that product from the manufacturer. You can declare your customs value as $80 rather than $100, and so you're paying that 25% tariff. So you're paying $20 on tariff on 80 instead of 25 on the $100 value. So you save a little bit of money per transaction. It doesn't seem like a lot, but when you're importing millions of dollars, there's huge saving. You can save millions. We've helped clients save millions with this, but it's also complex to set up. There are complex regulatory requirements in terms of documentation and certain statements. The goods have to be shipped directly to the United States, and you have to confirm that. So there's things you need to know to set those things up. Besides that, there's other programs like, of course, free trade agreements. Maybe you're not using a free trade agreement now if you're importing from that free trade agreement country, but if tariffs go up, maybe you might want to start thinking about. So it's another part of the assessment is looking at imports from FTA countries where you're not using the FTA, because you may need to here in the next future. And then there's smaller programs like things called Chapter 98 and exclusions, which are more targeted ways to save money. So there's strategies, there's government programs, there's things you can do. You got to get out there. You got to get ready for it. You got to know your data, your imports very well, and also your exports for drawback. And so start now, because then when the tariffs actually hit and we know the exact percentage, then you can act quickly.
I think that's an important part. Is some companies I'm speaking to, and they're saying, well, we're going to wait till January and see what happens, but it needs to be now. And we're talking a matter of weeks until this may be coming into force. So yeah, I think
January 20.
January 20th, exactly. We're now much less than a month away from that, and everything's going to stop for Christmas for a little bit. So there's limited time to prepare. And I think another important part as well is not just about kind of looking at the data and what you can do with it, but you need to make sure that your department, your function is being seen and heard by senior leaders within the organization. You need to make sure you're pitching to them as the importance of this, because they may not appreciate it yet. They will do when it starts hitting the bottom line quickly. But your ability to get them to understand the implications is really important here as well.
I love that you mentioned that, Jimmy, because it's really like what you should be doing as a trade compliance person in the company right now, right? Your role is much larger than maybe you think it is. Trade now has a seat at the executive level because of what's happening, because the implications are so big. But even if you're just a trade compliance associate or analyst in your company, and you're not seeing a lot of communications around this, take the lead, right? Send some emails out. Hey guys, can we start to look at our data? Hey guys, let's prepare for this, because communication is really important. And then of course leadership says, hey, these guys are really on the ball here. Let's give them the resources they need, because this could be lucrative in terms of duty savings, right? We're facing a big storm, but let's feed the army early so we can be prepared for the war.
Yeah, I think maybe 5-10 years ago, trade compliance was a lot more of a reactive department. Now you need to be proactive, and you need to be thinking ahead and trying to mitigate any potential impact. But interesting. And just from my curiosity here, we're talking about goods, right? Services, that's not being discussed at the moment. Is that correct?
That's right. So at the WTO, there's a moratorium on tariffs for goods for trade in services. So that's been continuing to be extended at the WTO, and it would be something extremely hard to implement if you wanted to implement services on tariffs. Tariffs on services. Depending on it, because sometimes it's just like a report that you wrote and you're sending an email across a border. How are how the authorities can know, right? Of course, if you have a good compliance program, you'll report that, etc. But it's a tricky thing to do, and it also facilitates this service economy, which is so important for the global economy.
That's what I thought. I mean, I hadn't heard anything about it and I assumed it's because of the importance of the service economy for a lot of the developed nations. Okay, interesting. And then we've discussed here about the importance or the dominance of that U.S.-China, the geopolitical tensions around that. I mean, do you think Trump will also increase control on exports of high tech to China? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I do because of who he's putting in his cabinet. Um,
Right.
Namely, Marco Rubio, the senator from Florida, has been nominated
Mm-hmm.
to be the U.S. Secretary of State, head of foreign policy for the U.S. And
Yep.
Rubio is on a couple of committees in the Senate that are focused on China, and not in a positive way. Let's be honest. A lot
Bit
of it
hawkish.
is targeting China for human rights violations, targeting China for economic violations related to the de minimis, the shipping of small products,
Yep.
targeting China for overt military movements, etc. So really, he has a laser-like focus on China. They have compiled a cabinet where they are prepared for economic battle, if you will,
Mm.
for or with the Chinese. And part of that was started with Biden. So 2 years ago,
Mm.
Biden implemented some very sweeping export control regulations on semiconductors, right? Not just
Okay.
semiconductors, but the machines that make semiconductors. So there's only three companies in the world that make the best machines
Mm-hmm.
that make semiconductors. And there's now significant restrictions on the most advanced machines being shipped to China. Controls. So that was a watershed moment in export controls for the
Right.
U.S. in terms of China, because it also targeted a country, not just an entity. And then
Mm.
it and that's continuing. They've continued to increase those controls. Maybe we see some
Mm.
big movements early on from the Trump administration in terms of export controls on wider amount of products, not just semiconductors, because there is a lot of concern about China's advancements in these technologies, and that it's being partially fed, by first U.S. purchases of all these goods from China, right, just allowing them to do all these
Yep.
research investment, but also investment from the U.S. So there was also some announcement of new investment restrictions a couple of months ago that U.S. investors investing in China have to go through some checks to make sure that they're not
Okay.
investing in some of these high tech areas. So an increase in the economic war, especially, and part of that is export controls, is happening and is going to increase in the next couple of years for sure.
Mm. Interesting. Okay. And then finally, I mean, I guess more getting your opinion here. We say hope for the best, plan for the worst. Looking ahead, I mean, what do you think could be the best case scenario out of this, and what could be the worst?
I always, try to start with the worst. Eat the food I like the least worst, and then I
Yep.
end with the best. So let's go with the worst case scenario, which is sharp and high, quick tariffs on many products quickly. Of
Mm.
course, on China, but hey, we may see quick tariffs on products from Mexico, on the EU, and a general import tariff. I'm skeptical because of the economic effect, but that's the worst case
Mm.
scenario, right?
Mm.
But maybe what they're going to do, right? They're going to lower taxes to try to help stimulate U.S. growth, so corporate
Yep.
taxes, and deregulation, so that helps, and then probably a package to help companies affected by retaliatory tariffs, right? So China, we put tariffs on China. The Chinese stop buying U.S. agricultural products, and
Mm.
U.S. farmers going to need some assistance, right? It
Yep.
seems it's what happened last time as well. There was a big
Yeah.
package for U.S. farmers, et cetera. But there could be significant economic changes in the next year or two, right? Because of this uncertainty. But watch the stock market
Mm.
because Trump will be also watching that really
He likes
closely.
it. He likes it. Yeah.
Yeah, he uses that as a kind of a barometer for his success. So, but sometimes you make a move that's hard to undo quickly, and so just
Mm.
to be prepared for any of that. So that's the worst case. Best case, I think, is I wanted to mention Trump's U.S. Treasury Secretary nominee, Scott
Yep.
Bessent. He is a big Wall Street guy, financier, kind of really plugged in terms of what's good for the U.S. economy, etc. Formerly wasn't liking tariffs, and then was up for the nominee, and now he thinks tariffs are a good idea.
What a
Go
surprise.
figure. Yeah. But he did say even a few months ago that what he thinks is prudent if any tariffs were phased in so that any associated price adjustments could be absorbed gradually. And I think that's a sign, right? It's a small sign, because what happened last Trump's presidency was that they did have a lot of battle, and I think the tariffs didn't go as high because there was so much internal conflict. I think there's going to be less conflict this time. I don't think there's much even debate about that, because he's got the people that are loyal to him, that are following his ideas. But if there's significant warning on the implications for how badly this could affect the economy, Trump may slow his roll a little bit, so to speak. So you could see like this general import tariff starting at 3 or 5%, and then every 6 months or 12 months go up, right? Slowly. So companies have time to adjust, move their supply chains, because a sharp, quick tariff doesn't really help. These companies make these adjustments, but if they are slow and they know that those tariffs are coming over the next 2 or 3 years, then okay, yeah, we really do need to get out of China, right? We need to start manufacturing somewhere else. Let's look at Vietnam or Mexico, or even in the U.S., right? So companies have that ability. And best case for the other side is, right, maybe there's negotiations for the EU to say, hey, we may try to tackle the China problem with you if you don't tariff us, right? And the EU already started, right? They put tariffs on Chinese EVs and batteries and et cetera. But maybe, right, there's some kind of agreement that could be worked out, because I think there's some alignment. There could be some alignment in terms of foreign policy goals from both, but there's going to be some backroom negotiations that will be fascinating to follow.
Yeah, I mean, it's that's why I enjoy this space, the link to politics, geopolitics, and the immediate implications from it. But it does keep my network up at night. So we will see how things develop. But I think it's interesting that even the best case scenario involve tariffs and be widespread, and it just means slower rather than quicker. But yeah, it will be interesting to see how things pan out. But Sean, I really appreciate your time here, and thank you for giving us this overview. And I'm sure the listeners and watchers of this will have learned something from it, and we look forward to seeing how this develops over time. And I'm sure, this time next year we could do another video like this, another podcast, and we can kind of look back and see how things have went. But again, thank you for your time.
No, thank you for having me. Really appreciated it, and good luck to you guys.
Thank you very much.